The story of Christ is, in many respects, one that can be understood as the story of three baptisms. It begins with the baptism of Christ in the Jordan. The event is told in 3 of the 4 Gospels and is alluded to within the 4th. We can think also of a second baptism, one that we might not initially think of as a baptism, but which is described as such within the Gospel of Mark, the baptism of Christ and his death. He speaks about a baptism that he has to undergo and the anxiety that he has until that has occurred. And then there is a final baptism, which is a baptism that he performs upon the church, the baptism of Pentecost, as Christ pours out his Spirit on his church and gives them the power of his Holy Spirit, uniting them to him by it. When we read the story in this way, we can think of connections with previous stories. We've already thought about the importance of the crossing of the Jordan as a place of transition. In the story of Moses, there is a transition at the end of his life to the ministry of Joshua that occurs on the banks of the Jordan. It's the same with Elijah and Elisha. There is an eremite or desert prophet whose ministry is succeeded by a prophet whose ministry primarily occurs within the land, and that transition occurs on the far side of the Jordan. In the ministry of Christ, this baptism is the one that initiates the drive of his declaration of the gospel. He goes into the land, he preaches in the synagogues, he heals the sick, he casts out demons. After this great baptism, this baptism is also something that represents a revelation of his identity. In that event, he is declared to be the beloved Son. The Spirit descends upon him in the form of a dove. And from that event, we have a sense at the very beginning of the narrative of who Jesus Christ is and what he is about to do. He is set apart for this mission, acting in the power of the Holy Spirit, and he's going to declare the acceptable year of the Lord, the year of the Lord's favour. But that story moves towards the point of the second baptism. As he sets his face toward Jerusalem, he's setting his face towards what he calls in the Gospel of Luke, his exodus that he will perform there. An exodus that involves going down into the abyss of death, into the deep of death, pulling open that abyss and providing a clear way through so that his people can follow on the dry land that he has created. These waters connected with the second baptism are waters that overwhelm. They're waters that are the threatening waters of the abyss and the deep. And Christ is going to forge a path through those waters of the deep and enable us to pass through their threatening realm and bring us through in safety to the other side. The final baptism is a baptism that is foretold at the very beginning of his ministry by John the Baptist, who declares that one who is coming after him will baptize them with the Holy Spirit and with fire. A baptism that is a baptism of cleansing, but also which will bring judgment. The Spirit is poured out from on high. The imagery is that of water that's poured out. Maybe water we might think of in the context of rain. Rain on thirsty land. As the Spirit is poured out on the church is the new life that grows up from the earth. As the Spirit is poured out, the church is united to its master. One of the things that water can convey is a union between two things. When water is poured upon something, it can be a means of conveying a particular property that's connected with the water or the one pouring it and the object or the person upon whom it's being poured. When Christ pours out his Spirit upon his church, the church is formed by his Spirit, is empowered by his Spirit, and starts to act in his name by his Spirit. The baptism of the church by the Spirit is in many respects a replay of Christ's earlier baptism, the baptism of the Jordan. As Christ was baptized in the Jordan, the Spirit descended upon him in the form of a dove. And when he baptizes the church, the Spirit descends upon her. As the Spirit descends upon the church is equipped to walk in the steps of Christ, to continue his ministry. The book of Acts begins with a declaration of all the things that Jesus began both to do and teach, things recorded in the gospel. That story is continued in the book of Acts, and it's continued in the events that occur in the life of the church. the work of the Spirit of Christ by his Spirit within his church. These three baptisms give us a way to understand what our baptisms mean. When we think about the story of the Red Sea crossing, for instance, there is a baptism that precedes what has been called the baptism of the Red Sea, and that's the baptism of Moses. Moses, in his infancy, is drawn out of the water. That's how he gets his name. In that drawing out of the water, there are many features of that story that anticipate the later story. We can think about the fact that he's drawn out from the reeds. Israel will be drawn out from the sea of reeds. Miriam sings on the other side of the crossing of the Red Sea. Miriam is the one who assists to find a nurse for Moses after he is drawn out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter. In these cases, what we're seeing is that the leader of the people anticipates what will happen to those after him, those who are brought into union with him, which is why Paul can speak about being baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. The Red Sea crossing is an entrance into the life and the story of Moses, so that Israel can share in the destiny of its leader. In the same way, we are baptized into Christ. We share in his destiny. The church, being formed by the power of the Holy Spirit that descends upon to Pentecost, is washed and prepared for its ministry. It's united with its master so that it will share the destiny of its master. And it is also a recipient of the baptism that he performed in the second great baptism, the baptism of his death. He has brought us through this great abyss of death so that we might know the new life on the other side. The story of the gospel, then, is a story of baptism. And each one of our baptisms recalls not just the stories of the Old Testament, the story of the flood, the story of the Red Sea crossing, the washing of the priests, all these sorts of things that we can see in biblical typology, but it is a uniting and condensed symbol of the story of Christ, bringing together his three baptisms and bringing us into union with them.